so much for coming. So my revolutionary idea is that we need critical media literacy education in schools now more than ever. To tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a senior. I'm majoring in secondary education with an emphasis in the social studies. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, but I just recently accepted a position to teach at a charter school in Newark, New Jersey next semester. So when I was a junior in high school, I happened upon a documentary called Misrepresentation. It had come recommended to me by several friends, so one fateful Saturday afternoon, I sat and I watched it. And not to sound hyperbolic or anything, but honestly, my life was transformed. Misrepresentation takes a hard look at the representation of women in the media, in TV shows, movies, video games, cable news networks, and the like. And it looks at how these portrayals affect our perceptions of gender. The results are often harrowing. The overly sexualized, one-dimensional representations of women that we see far too often in the media, some of which you can see behind me, are damaging young girls' self-esteem markedly. And it makes young boys see women as little more than objects. The documentary ends on a hopeful note, though. It asks the viewer to be a more conscious consumer of media, to really analyze what these shows and commercials are saying about women and why they're saying it. Asking yourself questions like, what are they trying to sell me? Or who owns these networks anyway? I had never been told to consume media in such a critical, active way, and it's changed the way that I view media and gender ever since. And while I'm so thankful that this documentary exists and that I had the chance to watch it, as I've grown up and entered the world of education, I've thought to myself so many times, why aren't we teaching these media skills in school? After all, students need these skills now more than ever. They're consuming media almost nonstop. A 2015 report by Common Sense Media found that the average American high school student spends 9 hours a day consuming media. To put that into perspective, that's more time than they spend sleeping or in school. And I've seen this firsthand in the classrooms that I teach in. In the current Tuscaloosa Middle School where I help teach, every student has their own laptop in class. And I can guarantee you that any time they're not working and being diligently observed by yours truly, they are on YouTube. They're either watching music videos or watching pirated movies. They might be playing video games or checking their Instagrams or their Snapchats. Not Twitter though, because they did tell me that Twitter is for old people. So anything that they're spending this much time doing is obviously going to affect them. So we probably should be teaching them the skills to deal with all this media, right? Well, we should be, but really, we're not. The vast majority of US schools and classrooms are still using a very old school, text-based approach to literacy. That means they're teaching students how to analyze sources like novels and textbooks and articles, like we can see behind me. And while these traditional literacy skills are still so important, reading and writing still are the keys to academic and professional success, anyone can see that there's a disconnect. Students are spending more and more time consuming visual and auditory sources than they are consuming text-based sources, but they're not receiving the instruction that they need to be able to decode the messages that they see in this media. And here's where it gets really important. These messages are never neutral. It's impossible for them to be. A quote from a seminal work on media education from the UCLA College of Education highlights this point. Because messages are created by people who make decisions about what to communicate and how to communicate, all messages are influenced by the subjectivity and bias of those creating the message, as well as the social context within which this process occurs. And ultimately, right now, most of these media messages are being crafted by dominant groups that reflect the current power structures. So that means that straight white men are largely in charge of creating the messages that we all receive about race and gender. These power structures become incredibly clear when we look at the 6 top paid media executives of 2017. These are people leading media juggernauts like CBS, Viacom, Discovery, Disney, and Time Warner. So here they are behind me. Do we notice any similarities between all of these people? And if you're still not convinced, here's a picture of the writer's room for the Netflix breakout hit Orange is the New Black. Now, this is a show that deals with a lot of issues about race and what it means to be a minority in the criminal justice system. And for a show telling so many stories about people of color, this writer's room looks a little bit vanilla to me. So students are consuming this large amount of media that's chock full of messages and biases about race and gender that are created by dominant groups. So how is this affecting our students? How does it affect their perceptions of themselves and their perceptions of others? As we've seen with misrepresentation, these effects can often be very harmful. Most people will internalize negative stereotypes about women and people of color through the media. It's honestly scary to think about the amount of influence that media has over the way that we perceive the world. It's not all bleak though, because there are ways that we can combat this internalization, and it's what I'm here to talk to you about today, a concept called critical media literacy. Now I know that this is like a kind of complicated academic sounding term, but it's honestly a concept that's pretty simple. Critical media literacy is about teaching students how to understand how media can oppress certain marginalized groups. It's teaching them that their depictions in media do not define them. It's turning them from passive into active consumers of media. So if you're in college, you've probably heard of critical theory, especially if you're in the humanities. And it can be a dense, complicated body of knowledge with many different iterations in many different fields. So I'll focus on what it means in the context of education. Critical theory in education, also called critical pedagogy, is focused around one thing: liberation. Proponents of critical pedagogy ultimately want schooling to be about freedom. They want it to be a tool that students can use to liberate themselves from oppression by changing the status quo and questioning existing power structures. Critical pedagogy is also preparing students for democracy. We don't want students that will simply regurgitate information, blindly following whatever they're told to do. We want students who can think for themselves, that can evaluate all the information that's in front of them and form their own conclusions from it. We want students that will question why things are the way they are, and what they can do to create a more just and equal society. So you can see how this concept of critical pedagogy fits in with media literacy, coming together to form our main idea of critical media literacy. It's a practice that teaches our students to always question the media that they're presented with, to never take it for face value, and to always wonder how media can be used to end oppression and create equality. It's a practice that will ensure that our students will never fall victim to the siren song of fake news. It's also a tool that students from oppressed and marginalized groups can use to liberate themselves. The same paper that I referenced earlier from UCLA argues that when groups often underrepresented or misrepresented in the media become investigators of their representations and creators of their own meanings, the learning process becomes an empowering expression of voice and democratic transformation. So, I know I've gotten pretty theoretical and heavy here, but the really cool thing about critical media literacy is that it's not just some topic that will only exist in the world of PhD students, never to be seen outside of the halls of academia. It's a concept that can be put to use and experienced in real-life classrooms every single day, and you can see my own real-life classroom in which I'm putting these skills to use behind me. So there's so many different ways that we can incorporate media studies in the classroom. Some of what we already do in history classrooms, like analyzing old photographs or evaluating primary sources, give students some of the skills that they need to analyze media. But it can go so much further than that, and it needs to. Students need to be directly engaging with the media that they see on a day-to-day basis. And that means, a lot of the time, losing the seriousness of school and academics. Yes, that's right. A lot of this will actually be fun for students. And I know I might sound like one of those chipper, annoying substitute teachers who comes in and is like, come on guys, learning's fun, but I'm serious about it here. So I want you to picture this scenario. You're back in high school, and you're taking my 5th period media studies elective course. So what's for homework, you might ask? Well, how about watching Star Wars? Watching one of the original trilogy that features Luke Skywalker, a straight white man as the lead, and then comparing it to the more recent The Force Awakens, which features a woman and a black man as the leads. This can prompt some seriously meaningful conversations about representation in the media. Why do so many movies have white male leads? What does this tell young girls about themselves? What does it tell young boys? What does it mean to see yourself reflected on the screen, in video games, in action figures? There are endless questions that are serious, that can be prompted by the viewing of honestly enjoyable material. Or, how about an in-class assignment of watching the record-breaking music video for Nicki Minaj's Anaconda, with parental permission, of course, and then comparing it to music videos by male stars, or I guess former male stars, like Robin Thicke and Bobby Shmurda. You can ask questions like, what does it do when men treat women as accessories? What's the difference between a woman declaring her own sexuality as opposed to men sexualizing her? And what is the overly sexualized representation of women that we see in all media? How does that affect how we treat women on a day-to-day basis? So those are just two examples of many, many different activities that can revolve around media in the classroom. And these can both prompt some really meaningful conversations that students need to be having, but they're ultimately not right now. But critical media literacy goes beyond just being able to consume and analyze media. It means creating your own media. If we really want to see a change in how people are represented, we need to make sure that we're teaching students to use their own voice and create their own projects. So back to my fictional media studies elective, my students will be completing projects all the time where they're crafting their own media, like advertisements for popular products that they use, songs or PSAs about current issues, maybe even writing and directing their own short films. My students will always be encouraged to tell their own stories. They're completely unique stories that they don't often get to see in blockbuster films or network television. And by watching their classmates' productions, students will realize just how valuable it is to listen to the stories of all people, not just the people at the top. So I know that the majority of you are not educators and do not plan on becoming one, but the skills of critical media literacy can help you and others in your life build self-confidence and reject negative stereotypes. So how can you practice these skills and teach them to others in your daily life? My first advice to you is to analyze the kind of media that you're consuming. Are you watching shows that are written by and featuring people of color, like Blackish, Atlanta, or Master of None? Are you watching movies written and directed by women, like the new critically acclaimed hit Lady Bird? Media executives, no matter who they are or what they look like, are ultimately after one thing, which is profits. So the type of media that we consume and the type of media that we buy is what will continue to be made. So if we want to see more stories from women and people of color, then that's the kind of media that we have to buy. My second piece of advice to you is a little bit more internal, but it's equally important. It's to always be questioning the media that you're presented with. And that means asking yourselves questions like, why is this advertisement portraying men this way? Why does this show only have one minority character? This news network is making me feel this way about female politicians. Why is that? Critical media literacy is not an isolated practice that you can pick and choose when you want to apply. It honestly becomes a way of life and a way of thinking. And incorporating it into your own life gives you an opportunity to think deeply about the people around you and why you think the way that you do. My third and last piece of advice to you is having conversations about media with the people around you. And this is especially important if it's media that perpetuates inequality. And this is also a really important step if you yourself come from a traditionally privileged group. So I'm sorry, but straight white dudes, I'm talking to you right now. You need to talk to your friends about harmful representations of women and people of color in media. So maybe your friend loved that new superhero movie. Maybe start a conversation about the costumes that the female characters were wearing. I mean, really, who could fight in most of those costumes? Or maybe your dad loves that new cop show. Maybe have a conversation with him about what all the criminals they cast look like and why they all look the same. I don't expect you to educate everybody in your life on media bias, but it is important to be ready to have these conversations when the right moment arises. So I know that I've criticized media a lot tonight, but I don't want you to go home and feel bad about turning on the TV or watching Netflix, because media can be an amazing tool that can educate, enlighten, and liberate. But it's all about how we use it and what we consume. I've told you tonight how much media can affect our perceptions of the world around us. And if we don't stay vigilant, we can internalize a lot of negative stereotypes about the people around us. So this is my plea for you to stay vigilant and to advocate for allocating resources so that students can learn these skills too. If we truly want a more just and less oppressive world, the future very well may start on our screens. Thank you so much.